Okay, good morning. We're starting again. We had problems before. We might still have problems. Um, if we have problems, please let me know. I'll try to pay attention to the comments that come through. For those who heard the first few minutes of the first recording, I apologize, but we're going to start all over again. And when we were kids, of course, in Color War, it was always the first time, and then you did the second time for points. So I guess this second time is for points. If the recording is breaking up, I don't know the solution. We'll just have to end up having a second, shorter class because, again, the phone got the standard, Samsung update, and there's been some bugs in the latest update. Okay, can't make a bracha because I said a bracha, but I could say l'chaim on the delicious coffee. The title of the class today is, and again, I ask any listeners that if it's breaking up, please let me know. The sound is not coming across properly. So the title of the class is, Do You Know Who You Are? Usually the immediate response to that is, of course I know who I am. But, there's multiple levels, multiple approaches, multiple ways you can answer that question. Because first of all, who you are in itself has multiple layers. You are different people. You are someone different to different people. To your child, you're one type of person. To your spouse, you're another type of person. To your parents, you're another type of person. To your community, etc., etc. So who you are is a question that you need to ask on all these levels. And then there's also the core of who you are. It also, in terms of your sort of qualities. Are you more of an intellectual? Are you more of an emotional person? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? There is the known Hayom Yom, a small, little, powerful book, Hasidic book compiled by the Rebbe of sayings of his father-in-law and quotes of his father-in-law, where the Rebbe quotes over there the following statement, that just as one needs to know their shortcomings, their chesronot, their lackings, their shortcomings, in order to rectify it, to improve upon it, to fix it, so too must one know their ma'alot, their qualities, their virtues, in order to utilize it in the best way possible. And I would say that in today's day and age, the second half is probably even more important and more effective and more necessary, although they're both important, because in order to properly use your ma'alot, in order to properly use your virtues both for yourself and those around you and beyond, you also have to be very mindful and work as much as possible to improve your negatives so that your positives are more effective, in addition to the goal of improving your negatives on its own, because that's what life is about. Lasot litaken, God created us to continue to grow and improve, as that is one of the signs of being alive, is that you grow and you improve and so on. So that's on that perspective, and that can be elaborated upon. And then there's also what our core is. And to highlight and bring this point home a little bit more, I want to share the following story that I sent out on Instagram on Friday. Short story, but today we will elaborate on that point a little bit. And as it relates to our discussion, our broader Torah discussion that we have here on Facebook, Sunday morning, and on YouTube, etc., and on podcast, both Google Podcast and Spotify. So, and I'm assuming also that you could probably get it on Apple's podcast. So the following story, cute story that is used the following cute story. Chelm was the city that people like to make fun of for whatever reason. So there was this simple fellow from Chelm who was traveling. He stops off in an inn, and he has to wake up the next morning, like really early, before sunrise, to catch his train to continue his journey. And he's sharing a room with a Russian general, and he asks the innkeeper to wake him up. Sure enough, the innkeeper in the morning wakes him up. He jumps out of bed, he's rushing, and not realizing, he grabs, instead of his clothing, he grabs the Russian general's clothing, uniform, and he dashes out. He heads to the train station, and sure enough, he catches his train. But he's like really surprised that everybody's giving him this respect, saluting to him and and just treating him like he would be someone special. He's not used to that. At some point he goes into the bathroom and he looks into the mirror, and to his horror he sees that he's wearing the general's uniform, and he says to himself, oh my goodness, he says, the innkeeper must have woken up the wrong person. He woke up the general, and I'm still sleeping in the inn, and I'm going to miss the train. So this is the cute little sort of story that is told about this simpleton, this simple Chelem individual. Chelem meaning from the city of Chelem. So this story is used again as a metaphor, as a lesson on various levels, asking ourselves, who are we? Are we the clothing that we wear and the broader metaphor that represents? A person has his core self, and he has the garments, so to speak, that he puts on in his interaction with those around him. So who are we? Are we our clothing? Are we the uniform? Now, this is not to say that clothing and what we wear is not important. In fact, the Talmud and the laws of Shabbat say that before a holiday, before Shabbat, you should put on honorable clothing. You should put on respectful, special Shabbat clothes or festival clothing, because clothing gives respect to the person who wears those clothing. And if you're not wearing the proper clothing, or you dress immodestly and so on, that also expresses, be it male or female, that also expresses who you are and the respect you have both for yourself and those around you. So not to minimize the importance of clothing. On the other hand, clothing and garments, and again, the metaphor of garments beyond just physical clothing, are not your essence. They are your expression. They are how you interact with those around you. So when you ask yourself who you are, that's a deep question that is important for you to know, so that you utilize, and not only utilize, but that you so that when the most important question perhaps in someone's life is, why am I here? What's my purpose? What's my mission? And so on. One of the important ways to reach that conclusion is by identifying and by knowing who you are. So I want to address this from this following perspective, based on the a teaching of the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, the holy Or HaChaim, Rab Chaim ben Attar, who and a sort of childhood memory of a personality by the name of Rabbi Yoel Khan. I say a childhood memory is not that I actually saw the story by myself, but it's a story that I heard as a youngster, and it very much fits the personality. But before I get to the story, I want to share this insight from Reb Chaim ben Attar. Reb Chaim ben Attar says the following: Or HaChaim, holy Or HaChaim, buried in Jerusalem, Har HaZeisim. So there's a verse in Psalms from King David, in chapter 119. And it says the following. It says, this verse, I'll read it in the holy language of King David, of the Psalms, Chishafti derachoi v'ashiva raglai el edeisecha. Which means I considered, and the translation here right on my screen, I considered my ways, and I returned my feet to your testimonies. And the way the Or HaChaim explains this verse, based on a question he has, the Or HaChaim on the first verse in the last portion of Leviticus is Im bechokotai teilechu, if you follow in my statutes. But the literal translation is if you go teilechu in my statutes. And the Or HaChaim has 42 explanations based on the 42 journeys that the Jews had and traveled when they left Egypt to go to Israel. So on this verse and this parsha, which is always read before we receive the Torah at Mount Sinai, the holiday of Shavuot, he has 42 interpretations. And he says, Im bechukotai teilechu. Why does it say, if you will walk or travel in my statutes, as opposed to keep my statutes? So he brings this verse from King David, which means like this: Chishafti derachai. I, says King David, was thinking about doing my own stuff. my own chores, my own to-do list. What do I need to get done? And for some reason, I ended up, Vashiva Raglai, my feet took me, Elei Dveisecha, to God, to your testimonies, to your Torah study. And the Orach Chaim says that a person should be in such a place that he's so connected with God's will, with Torah, with holiness, with meaningfulness, with spirituality, that when his mind wanders, or when he is, he sort of naturally ends up in that place of holiness, of goodness. I have a friend who was who is a mischievous kibitzer, we say in Yiddish / Hebrew. He's mischievous in his humor. So, the Amida prayer is the most important prayer when we stand, and as it says in the Code of Jewish Law, one has to imagine that he's standing in the presence of the King of all kings. And at that point, you're supposed to totally focus on the prayers, not to allow any outside thoughts. So this mischievous kibitzer would come over to us, fellow friends, and would say, don't think about sour pickles right now. So this was his way of, when someone tells you what not to think about, and then you have to try to get it out of your mind. So that was his way of kibitzing. But this story that I remember of their famous Rabbi Yoel Kahn, who passed away during, a bit over a year ago, who was a genius, and his whole life was Torah and the esoteric part of Torah and so on. So his wife, Mrs. Kahn, once asked him to take out the garbage. He lived on Montgomery Street. For those who know Brooklyn a little bit, you give us a thumbs up if you know Brooklyn. He lived on Montgomery Street. His wife asked him to take out the garbage. Okay, simple enough, right? A simple chore. But that morning, in 770, which is on Eastern Parkway, people see Rabbi Yoel Kahn, the great scholar, walking with a garbage bag to 770, the Eastern Parkway. They were wondering, it wasn't a common scene to see Rabbi Yoel with a garbage bag. It turns out his wife asked him to take the garbage, but his whole mind was going to the synagogue. His whole mind was thinking Torah. And his body just took him to 770, just took him to Eastern Parkway, to the place where he would study and record and teach the teachings of Torah, the teachings of the Rebbe. So, I assume that his wife learned, from that point on, not to ask him to take out the garbage. That's just my assumption. But I bring this up, and the lesson that comes with it, based on something that we learned and read in the parsha this past week, and the concluding parsha the week before. With regards to our father Jacob, the third of the patriarchs, it says the following. It says that in Rashi and in the Talmud, it makes a calculation, and I'm not going to go through the entire calculation here in this discussion, that if you look at Yaakov's life from when he's born, and then later on when he's in Egypt and he appears before Paro and he says, I'm 137 years, I think he says at the time, I don't remember, I believe so. So you see that Yaakov, B'meo Shloshim, I think 130 years, Yaakov, which in this week's Torah portion, talks about the fact that he had to run away from his brother Esau because of because he took away the blessings from Esau, and Esau's very upset with him, and he has to run away. But Rashi makes a calculation that there are 14 years missing of Jacob's life that we don't know where he is. 14 years. There's somehow 14 years between when he gets married to Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah, and he's running away from his parents, 14 years missing. And Rashi says, Nitman bebeis Shem be'ever. The answer to that is that for 14 years, Yaakov went ahead and he hid from his brother Esav in the yeshiva of Shem, the son of Noah, and Aver, who was the grandson of Noah. So for 14 years, he hid in the yeshiva. And I was just thinking, this is sort of my own thought, so you could take it or leave it. Maybe it has a source. We know that there is evidence that there's 14 years missing. but we have no evidence where Yaakov was for those 14 years. Why do we just assume that he was in Shem Ve'ever for these 14 years? Maybe he went to the Bahamas. Maybe he went to the Himalayas. Maybe he just went for a little break. He needed a break. He needed to de-stress. What is the assumption? That he went to the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. And from this we see that if Yaakov is missing 14 years, it's a given that what would he do with these 14 years? He would go to the house of God and study. That's what he would do. Somebody yesterday, when I was discussing this in the shul at my sermon, somebody mentioned that we already know from when Yaakov was in his mother's, Rivka's womb, when she went by a synagogue, he sort of agitated her because he wanted to go. He felt drawn to the place of holiness. So I take from this a lesson that, Yaakov, 14 years, it's a given. Where does he go? He goes and studies especially as he has to embark on this difficult journey of going to his uncle Laban and all the struggle that he had there. What does he do to prepare for that? He goes to the house of study and prepares himself for that challenge by committing to study of Torah and so on. What is the lesson from this? What do we take from this? L'chaim. What we take from this is that there was a famous Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, was a very known Torah scholar. And he once said, they asked him, how did he become a Gaon? A Gaon means a Talmudic Torah genius. And he answered, it was just from 5 minutes. And he then clarified, what does that mean, 5 minutes? He said, whenever I had 5 minutes, instead of wasting it, I sat down and I studied Torah. It was those 5 minutes that made me the Vilna Gaon, the famous Vilna Gaon. When asking who we are, there is a eternal, internal, deep answer to that question, and there's a sort of a practical answer to that question. Who are we when we're given 5 minutes? Who are we when all of a sudden we fall back an hour and we have an extra hour on a Saturday night? Do we spend that hour, wasting? Do we spend that hour watching a movie? Do we spend that hour with quality time with our kids? I have an extra hour. Do we spend that hour searching up and looking and learning some Torah? Do we spend that hour in community volunteer service? We have an extra 5 minutes during the day. What do? Do we immediately have to go to our phones and look up nonsense? Or do we do something meaningful during that time? And especially, do we say, you know what, let me use that 5 minutes for Torah study? What we decide to do naturally is a very strong indication of who we are, where we are spiritually. Now, that had, on a practical level, we could discipline ourselves, which is important to say, this is what I want to be, and this is what I'm going to do, which eventually will also affect who we are as a human being. And so in assessing who we are, this is one of the indicators of where are we? Ayeko, where are we? What is our spiritual standing? What are our priorities in terms of what we want to be and how we want to impact both ourselves and those around us? So so here lies this important lesson. Yesterday, my brother-in-law, Rabbi Denber, gave a very nice thought on the parsha also, where it says that Yaakov went out of Be'er Sheva and he came to Haran. And when Yaakov ran away from his brother, the Torah repeats and says Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and he came to Haran. Now we know he's coming from Be'er Sheva because that's where he was. Why doesn't the Torah just say he arrived in Haran? Because the Torah is telling us also, there's many answers to this question, many beautiful answers. One of the answers on a spiritual level is that the Torah is telling us that if you want to enter into a place, you have to leave the place you came from. The practical ramifications of that is today, you're coming home from work. And I want to make it very clear. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to all of us over here, including myself, because this is a challenge we all face today, right? We've become one with our machines. We've become one with our computer, one with our cell phone, and so on. And sometimes for the better, and sometimes not necessarily so. So he says, you want to enter, you want to come somewhere, you have to make sure to leave the place you're coming from. And I remember reading a statistic that even in terms of multitasking, that's a bit of a false notion, because multitasking, you don't necessarily achieve more because your brain could only focus on one thing at a time. And if you're multitasking, something is not being done properly, and errors might occur and so on. So Vayetze mi Be'er Sheva, in order to enter into Haran, you have to leave Be'er Sheva. If you are coming home, you have to, and you need to spend quality time with your kindlach, with your children, which is so important. You have to go out and go away and leave behind that where you are, that which you came from. And so too, when you're going to sit down and do some praying, some davening, you have to disconnect from that which you were engaged before, and you have to fully enter. Vayova, you have to come in and totally focus in what you are doing now. And so too when it comes to sitting down to study Torah. Shut down the phone, shut down the distractions. And it's interesting that the language that the Torah uses over here, Nitman, with regards to Yaakov, that he went for 14 years into the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, uses the expression Nitman. He hid. He hid. On the simple level, it means because he hid from Esav. But on the deeper level, it could also mean he hid. He hid from all the distractions. It's like the distractions cannot find him. He is now fully entered. Who are you? You are what you totally decide to commit to, especially on a spiritual level. Otherwise, you are not being there and that at that moment. So as I said in the beginning of this discussion, there are various ways, many ways you can answer this question, who are you? And it's perhaps beyond the scope of this class, as I say, because, often, because this is, a limited sort of Torah class. But one thing you are is after you decide, you're as discussed in the beginning of the class, what are your virtues? What are your qualities? What are your shortcomings? What you need to improve? What are your impacts? I will also share, I saw a nice little thought that Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg from Boca quoted, that Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva, Yaakov left Be'er Sheva. The reason why the Torah tells us he left, as I just mentioned that question, is because Yaakov's leaving Be'er Sheva had an impact. Yaakov impacted his city, and when he left, the impact was felt. So saying that his impact was felt, so from when on it's felt in a positive way. And in fact, the commentaries that when God judges us on Rosh Hashanah, future, he judges not our only impact and the fact we have impactors the way we and by what we do ourselves sort of represent the another is that patch of judging next who makes impact we around we individual is themselves they have the so you to ask how do you humor is not validation create is valid and have some ways who is and telling you and you know is the great they are and so in recognizing that you need you and you way Avinu, sorry for the disruptions over here, as Yaakov, when the gift that if it's here, you know, both of you have you enter it and have an impact, and the way impact is by engaging, doing who you are acting with, make and those you uh, uh, fully is there. Unfortunately, much spiritual this time, but unfortunately, spiritual fusion and dark point. So it's together and together to which only every one of us really pointed coming up about the light, its impact. So thank you. Many here. So others, everyone, fantastic.